John Henry Clark, who was a noted historian, would be 90-some years old if he was still alive, said this about history. He said that history is like a clock. It tells of people the historical time of day. It tells where they've been, where they are, and where they yet still have to go.
African Cemetery Number 2, earliest recorded cemetery in Lexington to be organized, owned, and managed by African Americans. The site has been in existence since 1869. Trustees of Benevolent Society Number 2 successfully operated cemetery. Many individuals buried here were important leaders in the community.
The people buried in that cemetery are largely the people who put a foundation for African American communities in Lexington following the Civil War.
And the story of these former enslaved men and women after emancipation is just graphically told in studying their lives. They became the leaders, the entrepreneurs, the business people, the civic organizers. They formed fraternal organizations. They were part of the Masons, the Colored Fair, the Colored Orphan Home. All of these people are buried in this cemetery. Early church leaders who founded and organized some of the early churches in Lexington.
I hold very strongly to a belief that when we do not know our history, when we do not have opportunities to learn about the biographies of people who have gone before us, then we lose opportunities to understand fully who we came from and who we can become. There are stories here that have been long dormant.
It's an almost forgotten chapter of Lexington's history.
This is a spot where so much national history is potentially located, and yet it's not really well known about. To me is a shame, and it's something that needs to be better brought out.
I have tried to unbury information about African Americans and bring it to light so that hopefully the full Kentucky narrative will be more inclusive of the contributions that African Americans have made.
That the cemetery has gone through so much neglect, renewal, desecration, vandalism, and it's still there. It's just been amazing that it has survived. I mean, just truly, because so many cemeteries just get wiped away, and this could have been one of them.
Part of the restoration is a continuation of the work that has been laid here by our foreparents. They're taking the task to buy the land and create the cemetery. It was part of a larger effort to create community, create a legacy, create a safe place for their children and their grandchildren.
And to know that this cemetery holds their remains, it also holds their stories. You cannot help but uncover their stories when you start looking for their names.
This story out here on 7th Street, with all this industry around us and all these railroad tracks, is an important story as any other story. This is your story too. Whether you are African American, European American, Latino, African refugees, whoever you are, wherever you're from, that this story is important to you as well. This story can inspire you.
Once you start working in a cemetery and finding the people that you find, the question is, how did this come to be? In October 1852, enslaved men organized to help each other, care for the sick, bury the dead, and perform other acts of charity. This is before emancipation. This is after the 1850 slave code law that required all states to identify any person they feel were running away.
Back at that time, you didn't have things like Social Security and insurance and stuff like that. People banded together. Like this cemetery was started by Union Benevolent Society number 2. And that was a group of people that banded together, and they would contribute to the welfare of the members of that society. It was sort of a self-help group.
That group was made up of freed people and enslaved people.
How could people, who we said were enslaved, who many couldn't read and couldn't write, how could they come out of emancipation and be able to buy land and create businesses and start schools?
African Americans were told, yes, you are free, but you have no rights. You can't vote. You can't testify in court. We don't recognize you as having made contributions to our state or city. These men and women who came out of enslavement knew otherwise. They knew they had God-given talents. They knew that they could make a difference.
The cemetery was organized and burials began in 1869.
They purchased the first 4 acres, paid $1,000 at 10% interest, and they had paid for it in 2 years. How did they do that? And how did they stay organized through the Civil War, have such a powerful group that after the Civil War and after emancipation, they had enough money to purchase property?
This was a benevolent society, meaning they didn't get paid to do this. And they didn't say to get paid to take care of the poor, to get paid for any of those things. They said that that was what they were supposed to do.
Henry King and Jordan Jackson actually purchased the property from the O'Meara family to found the cemetery, the initial 4 acres.
When the trustees first purchased this property, the deed said about 1.5 miles beyond the city limits.
While this was charitable, many of them were exactly that, business people, and they knew that they had to run this organization, the cemeteries, and everything else that they were affiliated with in a very business-like manner.
By April of 1875, they had purchased another 4 acres adjoining their first 4, and they paid for that in 2 months. How is it that these people who are supposed to be ignorant, who had no education or very little education, knew enough to say, yes, we matter, and we're going to show you we matter? They band together, they formed the school committees, they formed the self-help organizations that moved African Americans who had newly been freed out of enslavement and poverty.
And so, we find the early educators there, the early ministers, just community builders in general, those who were starting organizations and so on.
There's a lot of history here, not only for African Americans, but for the city of Lexington and the state of Kentucky.
The women who were buried there are founders of the Colored Orphan Home that was founded in 1892. They incorporated. They spent 2 years raising money in order to purchase property and a home.
And they started the Colored Orphan Home with pennies, okay? A group of women got together and they put pennies together to start this Colored Orphan and Industrial Home,
whose purpose was to care for orphans and elderly women. The city of Lexington was supporting the white orphan home, but there was no room at all for African American children. Jane Sanders has a wonderful headstone. It's a pillow in the cemetery, and on that pillow, I had to do a rubbing in order to see this, but it says, founder of the Colored Orphan Home, 1894. Priscilla Lacey, she was one of the first treasurers. She was a laundry lady, so she wasn't, she didn't have buku bucks, but she evidently was very trustworthy because they selected her as their first treasurer, and she remained treasurer until her death. Mary Gillis was one of the founding members. She was a member of First African Church, and she, according to their information, she remained a Sunday school teacher for almost 62 years. Charlotte Pogue was a matron at the home when it first opened. And all of these women took turns at keeping the orphan home running. They had what I call household duties, at keeping the day-to-day operation, and they took turns every week. Somebody would be responsible. They would be the supervisor for what was going on. They had kitchen industries. They helped the children learn skills that would carry them through life as well as to be gainfully employed. They had a shoe shop. They had a bakery, they had gardenings, so they not only raised their own food, but they also were able to sell produce. It was amazing to know that they stuck to their guns and they were able to keep this orphanage going. And it remained a home for orphans through 1988.
Went down to Kentucky just to play the fair. Went down to Kentucky just to play the fair. It's a mighty fine place. You all ought to go there.
The Colored Fair was an organization that promoted the idea that African Americans need to showcase the progress they had made since emancipation. It too was organized in 1869, but it was an activity that became the largest fair in all the state of Kentucky. They had visitors from Indiana, from Ohio. They would ship in here by train. They were very, very successful and established an amphitheater, a racing track.
Went out to the racetrack, races hadn't started yet. Went out to the racetrack, races hadn't started yet. Someone said the track is sloppy, boys, and I swear it was wet.
Almost all the early jockeys in our country were African American. Almost all the grooms, all the trainers, all the blacksmiths. And many of them are buried right here.
We know that there were at least 80 involved in the industry. And the thoroughbred industry would not have developed as thoroughly had it not been for the African Americans' presence. There's nothing on any of the stones except for one that tell you what his profession was. There is a young man, Joseph Scott, who died at the age of 16, and all it says is a jockey. No one has been able to find out who he rode for, where he died, nothing. He was 16. And you ask your question, how could a child this age be riding? African Americans were put on the horses as young child. They were introduced to the industry as young children, 6, 7, 8 years old. They were working in the stables. And as they got older and developed an affinity for the horses, and you began to sense how to handle them, groomsmen, trainers, owners would observe this. As they developed this talent or showed the talent that they had, they would be put on horses and they would ride, actually guide them in races.
Quite a few Kentucky Derby winners are buried in that cemetery.
In 1875, the first Kentucky Derby was run, and out of the field of 15 jockeys, 13 of them were African American. The winning jockey was Oliver Lewis. He's buried in our cemetery. Unfortunately, his name is not on the family headstone. His brother and mother's name is. Dr. Ann Butler, good for her, she tracked this story down.
The only information that I could find about Oliver Lewis was that he won the first Kentucky Derby, and he was riding Aristides.
There's a tragedy there, that there's a statue of Aristides, the first horse to win the Kentucky Derby, at Churchill Downs. But there's none of Oliver Lewis or of Ansel Wilson, who trained the very first horse to win the Kentucky Derby, who was also an African American.
There is much information about, the bloodline of Aristides and so on, but I couldn't figure out when Oliver Lewis was either born or died.
We sat at the table eating dinner, and Ann, Dr. Butler, pulled out this big stack of death certificates and split them in half and gave me a half, and she took a half, and she said, "Bruce, I'm looking for Oliver Lewis, who won the first Kentucky Derby. See if you can find anything with his name on it."
When I first started doing research, archival research, I was told I would never find information about African Americans. It would be very hard, because I was telling people I was looking for my family. And they said, "Oh, you'll never find it. You can't, there's nothing there." And it's not true. It is not true.
I gleaned through a lot of the records at Keeneland in their library, couldn't find anything, and ultimately ran across an obituary that mentioned Oliver Lewis, the once famous jockey. It listed survivors of his family.
And she finally discovered that Oliver Lewis had settled in the northern Kentucky area, and there was a possibility that they were descendants.
It turned out to be Oliver Lewis's great-granddaughter. She said she called the lady and told her who she was. She was Dr. Ann Butler, Kentucky State University, and she would like to come up and talk to her.
And the lady said, "Well, we knew our grandfather was involved in the industry because he was a bookie."
Well, my ears, really perked up to hear that.
Oliver Lewis, after ending his racing career, ended up being a bookie, which then was a legal occupation.
But she was dismissive of that information, because by the early 30s and 40s, bookies were almost like gangsters. It was considered as gamblers. And I'm sitting there knowing that Oliver Lewis developed a racing chart, a racing form used at the tracks,
which eventually evolved in becoming the modern-day racing form.
I pulled out a picture of Oliver Lewis and said, "This is the man I am looking for." And she went, "Oh my God."
The tragedy of not knowing is that this woman did not know her great-grandfather had won the first Kentucky Derby.
I could not describe the joy at introducing this woman to the legacy of her great-grandfather.
There's a unique monument over here, an individual named Cassius Clay Tankersley.
On his monument, it said that he was killed at a race at the Latonia racetrack, which is in northern Kentucky. He was 20 years old when this occurred. He was riding with the Dixiana Farm. Borac Thomas was the owner. Mr. Thomas had a monument commissioned for him, and he has this wonderful inscription on the monument telling, how much he respected this young man as a gentleman.
Soup Perkins, James Soup Perkins, winner of the 1895 Kentucky Derby, is buried there.
He tied a record as being the youngest jockey to have won a Derby in Lexington. He grew up on Thomas Street. There's a marker that says Perkins, beautiful white marker, but again, his name is not on it.
The famous jockey Isaac Murphy was originally buried here. Now, since then, they've moved his stone out of the cemetery, but this still is known as his original burial place.
He was originally buried in the cemetery in 1896.
And he was subsequently moved to to a grave beside Man o' War, and then Man o' War and Isaac Murphy were subsequently moved to the Kentucky Horse Park.
What that means is Isaac Murphy was literally buried and reburied the same number of times that he won the Kentucky Derby, 3.
Thought I went to see the horse they call Man o' War. I went to see Man o' War, the horse that had it lead. Say my baby says he's fast, but he really haven't got my speed.
One of the heartaches that I experienced over Isaac Murphy was that the people making the decision about reinterring him forgot about his wife, Lucy, okay? And they were, from what I can tell, virtually inseparable during life, you know, and it does not sit well with me that she remains in an unmarked grave.
Our cemetery holds the remains of all economic stratas of the African American community. And some of the stones are so beautiful. They were just, to me, exquisite. I mean, it's amazing because they were produced in a time when they were handcrafted. They weren't poured in a mold or had a standard pattern. Almost every stone in there is different. There were people in there too poor to put a monument on their grave sites. There were people who had friends and relatives who actually handcrafted the monuments, and to me, that said more than having the money to buy one.
There is a grave over in the front left part of the cemetery. The marker is broken in two, but it's still very legible, and you can put the two pieces together, and it says Sally B. Ford, and she died when she was, I believe, 7 years old. And the marker it's a very crude marker. The lettering on it was not cut into the stone. It appears to have been a concrete marker, and they drew it in the wet concrete.
There's an African saying that when an elder dies, a library closes.
So I started doing the research to find out who the people were and what they had done while they were living, and they became family to me. Mr. Jones is one of my favorite persons here in the cemetery. He became free as a result of the will of Elizabeth Parker, who was Mary Todd Lincoln's grandmother. His notation importance to us is that he saved funeral notices from 1806 to 1886. His collection of death notices is larger than anyone else's in the state. Moses Spencer was one of the free blacks here in the community, had gained his freedom about 1833. He became a merchant. He owned a used furniture business on Broadway.
Claiborne Lee, he died when he was 111 years old in 1902, so that meant he was born in the late 1700s. Right, so I did a little digging and found out he was a deacon at one of the churches here in Lexington.
One of the more interesting characters that we know is buried in the cemetery is Alexander Campbell Vinegar. Most people know him as Peter Vinegar. He was a minister here in Lexington. He used to preach these fire and brimstone sermons because the newspaper talked about the titles. Not everybody appreciated his sermons from what I've learned. Edward Jackson was a dairy farmer in Lexington, remained in Lexington, had 12 children, and they all survived. And he was probably the only African American in Lexington that actually had a dairy farm. Mr. Faust was the first principal of Dunbar High School when it opened in 1923. He wrote a history of education in Kentucky as part of his thesis work when he got his master's degree. James Andrew Scott, they called him Andrew. He became the first African American hired by the United States Postal Service as a mail carrier in 1892. Bertie Taylor, she was an educator, she was a teacher, and she advanced from being a teacher in county schools at Maddoxtown and Warrentown to county supervisor, and from there she went on to statewide supervisor for the eastern Kentucky counties. Her tombstone is beautiful. It has this beautiful Betty lamp, if people know what I'm talking about. It's a Betty lamp, but it's an engraved symbol on her graveside.
There are a lot of individuals with a military background buried in the cemetery. We like to focus on the Buffalo Soldiers because Kentucky was one of the recruiting grounds for the Buffalo Soldiers. Leslie Bohannon was in Company C of the 24th Infantry in the Spanish-American War. Joseph Byrd, it was in Company G of the 5th U.S. Cavalry. He was at Appomattox at the end of the Civil War. So if you think about the role that African Americans and the Union played, Kentucky being one of the largest suppliers of African American troops to the Union. G.T. Prosser fought with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and that was the first African American unit that was formed in the Civil War and fought in the Civil War.
And if you've seen the movie Glory, you kind of like know the story that they attacked a fort and a lot of them were killed.
He was captured at Fort Wagner. He was released after some months, rejoined his unit, and eventually paroled. And while it's interesting that he fought at Fort Wagner as part of that unit, what's even more interesting is the fight that he had with the Government Pension Bureau to get a pension equivalent to white soldiers at that time. And there's a series of letters back and forth between Prosser and the Pension Bureau. He is one of the most elegant writers I have ever seen, and it was by accident if you read his request. He talks about having fought as bravely as any other person, but he's only getting half the pension. But what we don't know is whether he ever got his pension or not. So that's one of those unknown stories that would be interesting.
As a child, we weren't taught any of these things. We knew nothing about the Buffalo Soldiers here or the Civil War soldiers that were here. The noble effort that these people made, really there was no chance to celebrate it because people just didn't know about it.
R.C.O. Benjamin was a lawyer, a newspaper man who lived in Lexington, and he was killed in a fight, probably shot in the back, I believe.
Mr. Benjamin was not a native of Kentucky. He was born in the West Indies in 1855. He educated himself, became an attorney. Mr. Benjamin was a well-liked individual. He had been editor of the Lexington Standard, which was an African-American newspaper here in Lexington. While he was here, he was an advocate for civil rights, and he encouraged African Americans to go to the polls and register to vote, and this would have been in 1900. People were not happy, particularly the European American community was not totally happy with Mr. Benjamin and his agitation for human rights. And he actually escorted them to the polls to make sure they got there. While he was there, he heard the registrar asking inappropriate questions while they were trying to register, so he challenged him. There was a gentleman who was a Democratic supporter, and he challenged Mr. Benjamin. They got into an argument and a fight, and Mr. Benjamin filed an assault warrant against this man, Mike Monahan. The sheriff picked him up, but they didn't put him in jail. They released him. Mr. Benjamin did not know that, so he returned to the polls to take another group of African Americans. And when he arrived, Mike Monahan was there. Mr. Benjamin knew that his life was in peril, so he left hurriedly. Mike Monahan followed behind him and shot him in the back. Unfortunately, there was no trial. Mr. Monahan, we don't know whatever happened to him, but he was never brought up on the charges. Essentially, we feel that he was murdered, and there was no ever justification for it. All of the newspapers, the Herald, the Leader, the Standard, they all were just incensed at what had happened. It was just a sad situation, but we're privileged to have him here, to have his remains stay here, and know that we can tell his story even though his life was cut short. He was about 45 years old when he died. And it took them 10 years to finally place a monument at Mr. Benjamin's gravesite. But when they did, it again was a citywide recognition of this man and the contributions he had made to our community.
So the cemetery, I think, represents that sense of post-emancipation need to build community, this post-emancipation period of renaissance of saying, well, even though we're faced with all kinds of Jim Crow laws and the night riders and the KKK and all kinds of examples of oppression and racism, we still have to build community.
When I leave Kentucky, I know I really can't lose. I'm coming back to my baby, but I'll have the Lexington blues.
It's always puzzled us as to why the cemetery just became so neglected. Cemetery number 2 had been in operation over 40 years, and they had used probably all the available burial spaces. The area around them had been developed, the railroad track behind them, the Loudon Avenue subdivision, so they were encroached. There was no way to go.
As society changed, integration started to take place. The community in this neighborhood started to change. The African Americans here started to move to other sections of the town.
I think the last records that they have where they had any interaction with that group was in 1932.
And that's when the majority of the early organizers and the subsequent generation after them started dying out, and the cemetery became abandoned.
And so the cemetery just sort of fell into disuse, and because the people who had a connection to this cemetery had moved away, the whole thing kind of just died down and became overgrown, and people tended to forget about it.
I've been duped, and I've been scorned. Yes, I've been duped, and I've been scorned.
And I remember in the 50s driving around, we'd drive around on Sunday, sort of family entertainment. And I remember driving down 7th Street here and seeing this cemetery. And at that time it was just overgrown and trash and junk, and it was just disgusting. And I was about 10 years old at the time. And it made me wonder how a city could allow that to happen to a cemetery. I'd never seen a cemetery in that kind of condition before.
I have talked to people who grew up in the neighborhood and they remember passing through the cemetery. They remember playing in the cemetery.
I mean, I was probably down in here as a kid. I grew up in Aspendale, which was a housing project up 5th Street. And we used to come down in here and play, pick blackberries, raspberries, things like that. But other than that, I didn't know anything about the cemetery.
In fact, many people were frightened to come here, scared of snakes and whatever that was here, but it was pretty much not cleared, and so you had to almost cut your way through.
Well, I never did go down in there, and I worked night shift at a hospital, and when I would go out, I'd always look over in there just to make sure nothing was coming out to meet me.
When we first moved here, it was high with weeds and just a lot of growth over there, and a lot of nice tombstones and stuff was there, and they got misplaced and broke up.
A couple of years after that, it got so high that you couldn't even see the taller stones.
And the other thing about the cemetery had never been enclosed. It was always open, just like it had been when they first bought it. There had been some wire fence strung along the Shropshire Avenue side and, of course, along the junkyard side. But the front and back entrances were always open. So people would cross the railroad track, come into the cemetery, and walk up 7th Street, go Chestnut, wherever they wanted to, and vice versa.
And people were dumping old refrigerators, mattresses. There were people that would come in here, and homeless people would sleep in here.
At one time, there was I don't know if it was a homeless person or what, but there was someone actually camped out living down in the back portion of it.
There was one character in the mid-1900s that neighbors in this area there on 7th Street talked about, and his name was Lost John. He wore a top hat and tails, and he walked the streets, played harmonica. He hung out down at the courthouse, I understand, in the court square, and he also walked up and down 7th Street, and several people have said that he helped care for the cemetery.
I'm going back where I come from. I'm going back down in Georgia. My wife died and left me 40. That's why I'm going back, Georgia.
You know, it's just a vague memory of me coming to this cemetery with my grandmother, and she would have shears, and she would have all kind of garden tools to try to clean it up, you know, around the site, and then she would plant a flower.
My father, many, many years ago, used to bring me over to the old cemetery on Memorial Day to remember and clear the grave and that sort of thing, so I would know where the spot was. But it was just a wild place. It was totally unkempt. It was in many ways just disregarded and disrespected.
Because nobody was taking care of it. Residents were complaining about the vagrants in and out of the cemetery, about the unkept condition, and the newspaper would have a picture in the paper every year showing how unkept it looked. The weeds were higher than the cars. I mean, truly, you couldn't even see. You wouldn't know that it was a cemetery except they said it was. And even though cemetery number 2 became neglected and it was overgrown because there wasn't a generation that stepped forward to save it, it still remained. Unfortunately, the cemeteries in Lexington, once they became overfilled and neglected, many of them were desecrated. The city would declare the properties abandoned, and they would have the bodies removed sometimes, many times not, and they would just crush the headstones to be used under foundations or just, you know, destroyed. From 1973, when they started documenting this issue with the cemetery, to 1979, the city had assigned it to Parks and Recreation. Well, it got to be more than they could take care of. So the city decided in '79, after they had merged, to declare the land abandoned and sell portions of it for development and keep a small part for a park. They were going to remove all the bodies and remove the headstones and place them in another location. But in order to do that, they had to know how many people were buried in the cemetery.
Oral history accounts indicated that there were 3,000 to 4,000 burials in the cemetery, and yet the only surviving document that listed the burials numbered to around 900.
They hired a company out of Owensville, Richardson Corporation, and he came in and determined that there were over 5,000 burials. No one had anticipated that number at all. So then the issue became, we don't have the money, A, to finish paying this man for determining how many burials are here, because he was getting $1 per grave, and we don't have the money to disinter this many bodies and move them someplace else. By this time, people in the community had heard what was going on, and they were not happy. And when it was truly threatened, there were individuals in this community who knew the value of the cemetery and stepped forward and formed the organization that saved it. So Mayor James Amato was sitting at the time. He appointed a committee. Reverend H.H. Green in 1979 was one of the first board members. He was elected chair of the group that became known as African Cemetery No. 2. They incorporated, and he started drawing people into the organization, talking to descendants, getting community support. So that particular generation in 1979 said we shouldn't allow it to be overrun, we shouldn't allow it to be desecrated, we shouldn't allow it to be considered abandoned and bodies disinterred. This is not how we respect our dead. So from that group, for 10 years they operated. Reverend Green died in 1986, but another gentleman, Reverend G.M. Smith, he was a minister, stepped into the leadership position, and he, along with other churches here in Lexington, continued to care for the cemetery.
Again, we went through periods of like restoration and neglect, and we called it the jungle in here. There's all kinds of, invasive honeysuckle and bushes and bramble bushes were just everywhere.
It looked better, but it was still unkept. It didn't look like Lexington Cemetery. It wasn't well groomed because they could not go in there every day to do any kind of maintenance work. You start with another 10-year cycle, and Thomas Munday and Bruce Munday come along and see that things have gotten out of hand again, and they step into the void.
We kind of like came in around the time that the last of those members were still alive.
Their grandparents were buried here, and Thomas decided he couldn't necessarily clean the whole cemetery, but he was going to clean up his grandparents' grave.
The day I did come, my brother was up to the front trying to find my grandparents' tombstone, which he did.
And when he found it, it was so dirty and covered with algae that he put it in the back of his pickup truck. This I just will never forget. He put it in the back of his pickup truck and took it through the car wash. I thought, oh my goodness. I thought, you're not supposed to do that. But when he showed me where the stone was, the stone's beautiful. It got it clean, and you can read it very plainly.
My brother's house was the instigator of a lot of this stuff.
He was in there more than anybody. He passed daily.
He enlisted friends and just asked them for 1 hour a week. Just come over and help me for 1 hour a week. Well, Thomas is very persuasive.
And he said, can you do that? And I said, well, yes, I can. And he said, good, come back next Saturday.
Well, Thomas pestered Pam Miller, Mayor Pam Miller, to death at that time.
And before long, he had people coming and the board got reconstituted, and it actually looked pretty good.
And we got a couple of grants. We were able to buy some equipment, and we came in here and we started just trying to make the place presentable.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, wade in the water.
Most of the people who became intricately involved in the cemetery, I don't remember how I met them, okay? They just showed up.
I got started with the cemetery after I read an article in the paper. I saw that and I thought, that's the cemetery that I remember when I was a child.
I had a friend that was working over here, and he asked me to come over and help him 1 hour a month. And no sooner I came in, he left, and I haven't seen him no more. So it's almost like I took his place.
I loaded my lawnmower in the back of the car and came over here, and I've been coming pretty much every Saturday since.
There are people who, go there religiously, practically every Saturday, and do the mowing.
When we came in here, there was Japanese nutsage overtaking the cemetery up to your chest.
It's not a piece of property that can simply be left alone.
We used to make fun of him because he had this machete, and he was going through the cemetery trying to cut the whole cemetery with this machete. And we like, that fool can't cut that cemetery with a machete. Well, strangely enough, he did. Mark worked tirelessly. He still works tirelessly to maintain this cemetery, to maintain this sacred place.
What you see now is really the culmination of over 15 years, I guess now, of work.
Although it was very difficult to keep up with the grass. There just weren't enough people, and we didn't have the big heavy-duty mower. It was mostly push mowers and string cutters.
But really a lot of hard hand labor trying to keep ahead of the vegetation.
When I first came here, we didn't have the mowers that we have now, and I thought that I could pretty much make a big impact with a push mower. And at the same time, I thought there would be a good opportunity for me to get exercise in the push mower. Well, it really, I didn't accomplish much, and it kind of wore me out. So later, I purchased me a self-propel mower, because I really thought with a self-propel mower, I could really get something done. And it's 8 acres here, and a self-propel mower didn't do as much good either.
But actually what I found is that when you think about various forms of quiet time, even though I'm on a mower every weekend, it's actually very quiet, contemplative time for me. So it's a chance to get away from everyone, because no one wants to help you when you're mowing.
It's a stress reliever, and even though I don't have any family in here, I do enjoy my time spent in here.
After you've mowed for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you go by the same tombstones and you read the inscriptions, you kind of get to know the people. They're more like family. So you want to be sure that they're taken care of.
Well, I tell you, when I was cutting up in the front part, the middle section, and as you cut and you kind of look at the names on it, I was cutting one day and I looked down and my name was on one of them. So usually when I get to that one, I give it extra special attention, and I even put flowers on it every year.
I recall numerous times we were back in the back just trying to repair the chain link fence, and people would come by and tear it down and we'd repair it again.
And even though we have a fence put in, we always were going to have trouble keeping out the other vegetation coming back in. So this is an ongoing struggle to make sure that we can keep the property of the cemetery well maintained and cleared out.
There was a summer, 2003, I believe, when someone came in with a vehicle and knocked over 36 stones. It just was more than any of us could deal with. I mean, some of the prettiest stones that we had, the largest stones that we had.
We talk about the sadness of vandalism, and it is sad. But there's a Christian scripture that says, but joy comes in the morning, okay? We are now in the morning of the cemetery. And so more than sadness, I feel joy. This place has a 200, and I'm not really sure what the figure is, some $1,000 fence around it. That it's on the National Register of Historic Places, that tours are done on it. Joy comes in the morning. And so while we know there's some things that have been done here that are sad, once again I say, joy comes in the morning. What a glorious morning. It's a beautiful day today, isn't it?
The project, both the preservation of the cemetery, the research efforts, are part of an ongoing struggle for African Americans to retain vestiges of African American heritage where we can. And it is even a struggle to maintain the site as a sacred burial ground.
Our great-grandparents, grandfathers, grandmothers, before emancipation, post-emancipation, had recognized the need to create again cemeteries, schools, orphanages, businesses, and they said, well, we're going to do our work in our lifetime, and we're passing on the baton.
What I hope will happen is that it will continue to provide a sense of living history for the community.
Because it's important that we keep this early reminder of who we are, where we've come from, and how we progressed.
So I think at the point now where we are, we have the fence around it, most of the stones are all up, we've kind of gotten down to a science, how to keep the grass cut, things like that. I think now that what we're trying to do is create this greater sense of awareness in the community. Part of our work early on was just to bring young people in here and have them walk in here and get over the fear of being in the cemetery. It's always glorious to come in here with young people and have them discover things and see what they connect up with.
I don't know exactly how long I've been coming here. It seems like as long as I can remember. It's a nice cemetery, you know, it's like a nice place. It's not creepy at all. There's a Emma Bailey's tombstone. It's like over there behind the bush. That's been like my favorite. I don't know why, I just like, I liked the way it looked. It was just really pretty. So I remember I'd come, like each time I came here, I'd go over there, I'd like pick a flower and I'd put it there as a present for Emma Bailey.
None of us get paid to do this. It's all volunteer, and we all find our passions, and this is a passion for the group that's working now. And will be passion for the next group that comes in behind us.
The more people know about it, then the more they can care for it and take care of it.
Before, a lot of people didn't know. Those who did know knew it through weeds and overgrown bushes, and so it wasn't a comfortable place to come to. While they'd heard stories, they didn't get to look the stories in the face. Now you can come look the stories in the face.
You come out here on any given morning or late in the afternoon. This is really a pleasant place to just come and just relax.
When I first came into the cemetery, basically I was looking for my own family. I had asked my mother to go with me and point out the headstones that she recalled her great aunt decorating. She showed me an area. She couldn't tell me exactly where the stones were, but she showed me the area where she thought they were buried.
After seeing what it had came from and to where it was headed, I started volunteering. Then I ended up being on the board, and I found out so much history about the cemetery that I got more and more involved in it. So now, at this point, it's just a labor of love for me.
And as I walked through the cemetery, I began to see these headstones of my family. When I finally finished counting and recording information from all the headstones, I discovered I had 42 family members buried on my maternal side, buried in that cemetery. And it was almost overwhelming for me.
This cemetery is part of this whole national effort to lift up, if you will, all the history, all the people who have made this country what it is.
And as I started doing the archival research, I found that I had relatives who had been instrumental in starting the cemetery and keeping it going during their lifetime. So then it became a personal journey.
This tells where we've been. And so it's important because we need to know that. We need to know the struggles and we need to know the victories.
They established the cemetery. It was up to a next generation, and sometimes it skips a generation. I happen to be that person. There is a poem that says every tribe has a storyteller, and each storyteller's responsibility is to tell the story of those who've gone before you. And that's what I do.
The world's a good place, and our only purpose on it is to do good work.
This cemetery is sort of like a time machine. When you're out on 7th Street, you're out on the road, on the sidewalk, and there are big heavy trucks going by and a lot of traffic and everything. But the minute you come through those gates, it gets quiet and peaceful, and you hear the birds and the wind blowing through the trees. And it's a different atmosphere the minute you cross that line. And you look around and you see the markers and you read the inscriptions. And these are the people, some of the people, that helped build this town long before I lived here. So we owe these people a debt of gratitude and respect, and helping to maintain this cemetery is how I do that.
I think this is one of the prettiest stones we have. Has a hand, male and female hand. Like in holy matrimony.